At 03:58 on the morning of April 16, 1940, the sky over the Oder River didn't just turn bright. It turned white. 22,000 Soviet artillery pieces fired simultaneously. To Sergeant Nikolai Volkov, standing in the open hatch of his T-34-85, it felt like the atmosphere itself had ignited. The sound wasn't a noise. It was a physical pressure that punched him in the chest and rattled his teeth. He was 24 years old. He had fought from the burning oil fields of the Caucasus to the snows of Ukraine. He had seen Tiger tanks in the distance and Stuka dive bombers overhead. But he had never seen anything like this. Volkov was part of the 8th Guards Army, commanded by the legendary Vasily Chuikov, the man who had held Stalingrad. Now, they were the spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the Third Reich, Berlin. The objective was simple on paper: cross the river, breach the Seelow Heights, encircle the city, end the war. But as Volkov looked at his tank, tactical number 422, he felt a knot of dread in his stomach that no artillery barrage could cure. His T-34 was the best medium tank of the war. It had a reliable V2 diesel engine producing 400 horsepower. It had a high-velocity 85mm ZIS S-53 gun that could crack a Panther at 1,000 meters. It had sloped armor that had shocked the German generals in 1941. But in April 1940, Volkov knew a secret that the propaganda reels back in Moscow didn't show. His tank was obsolete. Specifically, his armor was obsolete. The side armor of a T-34-85 was 45mm thick. In 1941, that was enough to stop a German 37mm anti-tank gun. But this wasn't 1941, and the enemy wasn't just shooting shells anymore. They were shooting chemistry. Waiting for Volkov in the trenches of the Seelow Heights and in the cellars of Berlin was a weapon that terrified Soviet tankers more than the Tiger tank. The Germans called it the Panzerfaust, the tank fist. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a cheap toy, a disposable steel tube with a warhead that looked like a melon stuck on the end. It had no recoil. It required almost no training. A 12-year-old boy could learn to fire it in 5 minutes, but that melon-shaped warhead contained a shaped charge that could punch through 200 millimeters of steel. Volkov had 45 millimeters. The math was brutal. If a Panzerfaust hit his tank, the jet of molten copper would ignore his armor completely. It would liquefy the crew. It would detonate the ammunition. It would turn his 32-ton machine into a crematorium. Volkov looked at the other tanks in his company. They didn't look like parade ground machines. They looked like moving garbage heaps. The crews had scavenged everything they could find. Some had welded spare track links to the hull. Some had stacked sandbags on the front glacis plate until the suspension groaned under the weight. But Volkov and his driver, mechanic Ivanenko, had done something different. They had gone into a bombed-out German village the night before. They hadn't looked for gold or watches. They had looked for beds. Welded to the side of Volkov's turret, sticking out about 30 centimeters from the steel, were the rusty, twisted remains of iron bed frames, wire mesh, and below that, strapped to the fenders with thick towing cables, were 3 massive pine logs, still smelling of sap. A political officer from the NKVD had ridden past the column an hour ago. He had screamed at Volkov. He called the tank a disgrace. He said it looked un-Soviet. He threatened to have the crew arrested for looting state property and defacing a combat vehicle. "You are making the Red Army look like gypsies," the officer had shouted. Volkov had just saluted and stared straight ahead. He didn't care about looking like a gypsy. He cared about the physics of survival. Because Volkov had a theory. It was a stupid theory. It wasn't in the manual. The engineers back in the Urals hadn't tested it. But Volkov believed that these stupid logs and these primitive bed springs were the only things that could stop the high-tech German death ray waiting for him across the river. At 05 on Utu, the artillery stopped. The silence was louder than the noise. Then, a green flare rose into the smoky dawn sky. "Driver, forward," Volkov said into his throat microphone. The diesel engine roared. The tracks clattered. Tank 422 lurched forward toward the Silo Heights, toward the mud, and toward the deadliest ambush in the history of armored warfare. The Battle of the Silo Heights is often glossed over in history books as just a bumping action before Berlin. It wasn't. It was a slaughter. The Germans had flooded the valley. The ground was a soup of mud and water. As Volkov's tank hit the low ground, the speed dropped. The wide tracks of the T-34 churned the muck, but they were barely moving at walking pace. And then, the German anti-tank guns opened up. But it wasn't the 88s that worried Volkov right now. It was the infantry. The German defense doctrine had changed. They knew they couldn't match the Russians tank for tank. So they had turned their infantry into tank killers. Every trench, every foxhole, every bush could hide a man with a Panzerfaust. Through his periscope, Volkov saw a flash from a cluster of trees to his left. "Left! Infantry!" he screamed. His turret gunner, Corporal Zaitsev, spun the traversal wheel. But the turret was heavy. It took seconds to rotate. In the time it took to turn, Volkov saw the smoke trail. A Panzerfaust 60 has a range of, 60 meters. But to be accurate, you had to be closer. Maybe 30 meters. This shot came from 40. The warhead wobbled in the air. It wasn't a high-velocity dart like a tank shell. It was a slow, clumsy projectile. You could actually see it coming. That was the worst part. You had time to realize you were about to die. The projectile slammed into the mud 5 meters short of the tank. Explosion. Mud sprayed over the vision blocks. Volkov wiped his periscope. "High explosive," he ordered. Zaitsev fired the 85mm gun into the trees. The woodline erupted. They were lucky. That time. But Volkov saw what happened to the tank behind him. It was commanded by Lieutenant Petrov, a T-34 without the logs, without the mesh. Just standard factory steel. A second Panzerfaust shot out from the same tree line. It hit Petrov's tank square on the turret ring. There was no ricochet. There was no spark. Just a flash of light. And then a jet of fire erupted out of the commander's hatch like a volcano. The ammunition had cooked off instantly. The turret, weighing 7 tons, was lifted 3 feet into the air by the internal pressure before crashing back down. Petrov and his crew never even screamed. They were vaporized in a millisecond. Volkov watched the burning hulk through his rear periscope. The smell of burning diesel and roasting meat began to drift through the ventilation fans. He looked at the logs strapped to his side. He looked at the ugly, rusty bed springs vibrating on his turret. The political officer called them trash. Volkov patted the steel wall of the turret. "Hold on," he whispered. "Just hold on." They were still 70 kilometers from Berlin, and the trap was just opening. To understand why a pine log or a rusty bed spring became more valuable than gold to a Soviet tanker, we have to understand the monster they were fighting. The Panzerfaust wasn't just a grenade. It was a triumph of physics. It relied on a principle discovered in the 19th century by an American named Charles Monroe. The Monroe effect. Here is the forensic breakdown of what happens when a Panzerfaust hits a tank. The warhead isn't a solid block of explosives. Inside the metal cone, the explosive is shaped with a hollow cavity, lined with a thin layer of copper. When the fuse strikes the armor, the explosive detonates from the rear forward. This focuses the blast wave into the center. It collapses the copper liner. But it doesn't melt it. Not technically. It puts the copper under such extreme pressure that the metal behaves like a liquid. This process creates a hypersonic jet, a spear of copper, no thicker than a pencil, moving at 25,000 feet per second. That is Mach 25. Kinetic energy is mass times velocity squared. When a jet of metal moving at Mach 25 hits steel armor, the steel doesn't act like a solid anymore. It pushes out of the way like water. The copper jet erodes its way through the armor. It takes microseconds. Once inside the tank, the pressure release is catastrophic. The jet sprays molten metal, spalling, shrapnel from the tank's own wall, and extreme heat in all directions. It blinds, burns, and shreds the crew. If it hits a fuel tank, fireball. If it hits a propellant casing for the main gun ammo, catastrophic detonation. This was the weapon that was being manufactured by the millions in 1945. But the Monroe effect has a weakness. It is extremely sensitive to standoff distance. For the jet to form perfectly, the explosion needs to happen at a precise distance from the armor. If it's too close, the jet doesn't have time to focus. If it's too far, the jet stretches out, breaks up, and loses its punching power. The German engineers knew this. The nose of the Panzerfaust was designed to create the optimal distance. This is where the debate began. In 1944, as the Russians encountered these weapons, panic spread. Tank crews started improvising. The first instinct was sandbags. It makes sense, right? Sand stops bullets. Sand stops shrapnel. Why not put a wall of sandbags on the front of the Sherman or the T-34? Generals, even General Patton in the U.S. Army, hated this. But crews did it anyway. But post-war testing revealed a horrifying truth about sandbags. Against a shaped charge, sandbags often helped the enemy. Why? Because the sand didn't detonate the warhead early enough to disrupt the jet. Instead, the heavy, dense sand provided a tamping effect. It contained the explosion, focusing the blast more efficiently against the armor. And the soft surface of the bag meant the fuse hit squarely, ensuring a perfect detonation. Crews who covered their tanks in sandbags were essentially welding their own coffins. Then there was concrete. Some crews poured concrete onto the front slopes. This added tons of weight. It strained the transmission. It overheated the engines. And when a kinetic round hit it, the concrete shattered, turning into deadly shrapnel that killed the infantry riding on the tank. Against a Panzerfaust, it offered almost no protection against the copper jet. So, why logs? And why bed springs? This brings us back to Sergeant Volkov. He wasn't a physicist. He was a survivor. He had noticed something about the Panzerfaust warhead. It had a rounded, bulbous nose, and the fuse was a simple crush switch in the center. Volkov theorized that if he could catch the warhead before it hit the steel, if he could make it detonate early, or better yet, make it tip over, he might survive. This is the concept of statistical armor. Volkov wasn't trying to stop the jet with mass. He was trying to disrupt the fuse. The bed springs, which were often actually wire mesh fencing or actual sleeping frames, were mounted about 20 to 30 centimeters away from the turret. The idea? Scenario A. The Panzerfaust hits the metal slat. It detonates early. The jet forms 30 centimeters away from the armor. It travels through the air. By the time it hits the actual tank, the jet has lost focus. It might still gouge the steel, but it won't punch through. Scenario B, the best case. The rounded nose of the Panzerfaust slips between the wire slats. The fuse doesn't hit anything hard enough to trigger. The warhead gets ripped off, or it tumbles. If the warhead detonates while it is tumbling, even by a few degrees, the copper jet shoots sideways. It misses the crew compartment entirely. And the logs? The logs were originally for unditching. Russia is a land of mud. Every T-34 carried a saw and a log to strap to the tracks to pull itself out of a swamp. But crews started bolting them to the sides. Wood is fantastic at absorbing shock, but more importantly, it is soft. When a shaped charge hits soft wood, the detonation wave is different than when it hits hard steel. The wood splinters and gives way. It disrupts the perfect geometry required for the copper liner to collapse. Volkov's tank, 4-2-2, was an experiment in survival. He had logs on the sides to protect the fuel tanks. He had mesh on the turret to protect the commander and gunner. He knew it wasn't perfect. He knew that if a high-velocity 88mm shell hit him, the logs would just be kindling for the fire. But in the streets of Berlin, the 88s couldn't maneuver. The threat was the boy in the window with the tube, and against that boy, Volkov was betting on the wood. By April 20th, the 8th Guards Army had breached the Silo Heights. They were on the outskirts of Berlin. The landscape changed from muddy fields to suburban hell. Small houses, brick walls, cellars. General Chuikov issued a new order. No tank moves alone. He invented the assault group tactic. 1 heavy tank, IS-2, 2 medium tanks, T-34s, a squad of sappers, engineers, and a squad of submachine gunners riding the tanks. Volkov's company was assigned to Assault Group 5. Their objective, the Moltke Bridge. To get there, they had to cross 5 kilometers of urban nightmare. As they rolled past the Welcome to Berlin sign, Volkov looked at his loader. "Load canister," he said. Canister is basically a giant shotgun shell for a tank. Hundreds of steel balls. It's useless against tanks, but against infantry, it wipes the street clean. They were entering the cage. April 23rd, 1945. Berlin was burning. The smoke was so thick it blocked out the sun. It was noon, but it looked like twilight. Volkov's tank rumbled down a cobblestone avenue in the Köpenick district. The noise was deafening. The squeal of tracks, the roar of engines, the constant thump, thump, thump of Soviet artillery pounding the city center. They adopted the herringbone formation. Volkov's tank watched the windows on the right side of the street. The tank behind him, commanded by Lieutenant Brezhnev, watched the left. The submachine gunners, the tankodesantniki, didn't ride on the armor anymore. That was suicide. They walked alongside the tanks, spraying bullets into every open window, every cellar vent. Volkov stood in his hatch, head exposed. This was against regulations. He should be buttoned up. But in urban combat, buttoning up means you are blind. A tank with the hatches closed can only see through tiny periscope slits. A Panzerfaust team can sneak up to within 5 meters, and you would never see them. Volkov chose to risk a sniper's bullet to save his tank from a rocket. "Movement! 2nd floor! Gray building!" Volkov shouted. Zaitsev swung the turret. It wasn't a Panzerfaust. It was a machine gun. Zaitsev didn't use the main gun. He fired the coaxial machine gun. Short, controlled bursts. The gray building's facade chipped away. The enemy fire stopped. "Clear," Zaitsev said. They advanced another 50 meters. Then, the world exploded. It came from a basement window, almost at ground level. A Panzerfaust fired at the tank behind Volkov. Lieutenant Brezhnev's T-34. Brezhnev didn't have logs. He didn't have mesh. He had followed the regulations. The warhead hit the track fender. It burned through the thin armor of the lower hull. Volkov spun around just in time to see the catastrophe. The T-34 shuddered. A split second later, the ammunition stowage in the floor detonated. The entire tank lifted off the ground. The turret cartwheeled through the air and crashed into a storefront. There were no survivors. 1 second, a fighting machine. The next, a burning pyre. "Sniper in the cellar!" the infantry sergeant screamed. The Soviet infantry rushed the building. Flamethrowers, grenades. They showed no mercy. Volkov felt the sweat pouring down his back. His hands were shaking on the commander's override handle. That could have been him. Why Brezhnev? Why not him? Luck. Just luck. They pushed forward. The resistance was getting stiffer. They weren't fighting the Wehrmacht anymore. They were fighting the SS Nordland Division, Scandinavian volunteers, fanatics, and the French Charlemagne Division. Men who knew they couldn't surrender. And mixed in with them, terrified 15-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth, armed with crates of Panzerfausts. Volkov's tank turned a corner onto a wider boulevard. Suddenly, he saw them. A barricade. Trams filled with rocks, overturned trucks, and behind it, a German Panther tank, dug into the rubble. Only the turret was visible. "Tank front!" Volkov dropped into the turret and slammed the hatch. "Armor piercing! Range 400! The Panther fired first. The German high-velocity 75mm shell screamed down the street. It hit the cobblestones 10 meters in front of Volkov's tank, ricocheted, and slammed into the lower glacis plate. Clang! The sound was like a sledgehammer hitting a bucket while your head is inside it. Volkov's ears rang. "Report!" he screamed. "We're alive!" Ivanenko shouted from the driver's seat. "Ricochet!" The angle of the T-34's front armor had saved them. The shell had skidded off. "Fire!" Volkov ordered. Zaitsev fired. The 85mm shell hit the Panther's turret mantlet. Sparks flew. Non-penetration. The Panther was reloading. "Driver, reverse, smoke!" Volkov popped the smoke canisters. The tank lurched backward, retreating behind the corner of a building. They sat there, breathing heavy in the fume-filled darkness. They couldn't penetrate the Panther from the front, not from this range. Volkov grabbed the map. "We need to flank him," he told the crew. "There's an alleyway to the right," Ivanenko said. "It looks tight. Will we fit? Maybe, if we scrape the paint." "Do it!" The T-34 roared and turned into the alley. It was narrow. The logs on the side scraped against the brick walls of the buildings, screeching like banshees. Brick dust rained down on the engine deck. This was a dangerous move. In an alley, you can't turn the turret. If there was a Panzerfaust team above them, they were dead. Volkov watched the upper windows through his periscope, pistol in hand. Every open window looked like an eye. Suddenly, movement. 3rd floor. A balcony. A figure popped up. A German soldier. He was holding a tube. He was almost directly above them. "Up! Up!" Volkov screamed, trying to get the gunner to elevate. But the main gun couldn't elevate that high. The German leaned over the railing. He aimed the Panzerfaust down at the engine deck, the thinnest armor on the tank. Volkov did the only thing he could do. He opened his hatch, stood up, and fired his T-33 pistol. Bang, bang, bang. He missed. The German fired. Whoosh! The warhead streaked down. Volkov dropped back into the tank and cringed. Crunch! The tank rocked. Volkov waited for the fire. He waited for the explosion. Nothing. Just the sound of the engine idling. Damage? He yelled. Engine temp is normal, the mechanic yelled. No fire lights. What happened? Volkov risked a look through the rear vision slit. The Panzerfaust had hit. But it hadn't hit the engine deck. It had hit the log. The pine log, strapped to the right fender, sticking out slightly past the hull. The warhead had struck the round surface of the wood at a steep angle. Because of the angle and the softness of the bark, the crush fuse hadn't triggered immediately. The warhead had glanced off the log, tumbled, and detonated against the cobblestones beside the tank. The blast had scorched the paint and shredded the external fuel drum, which was empty, thank God. But the jet, the lethal copper spear, had buried itself harmlessly in the dirt. The stupid log had just saved them from a top attack kill. Forward! Get us out of here! Volkov screamed. The tank surged forward, bursting out of the alleyway. They were now on the flank of the Panther. The German crew didn't see them coming. They were still watching the main street. Target right, range 50 meters, Vier! The 85mm gun barked. At 50 meters, the side armor of a Panther is paper. The Soviet shell punched through the ammo rack. The Panther didn't just burn, it disintegrated. The explosion blew the turret clean off. Volkov slumped back in his seat. He patted the wall of the tank. Good wood, he muttered. Good wood. April 29th. The battle for the Reichstag. The fighting had devolved into madness. The Soviets were fighting floor by floor, room by room. Volkov's tank was supporting an infantry assault on a heavily fortified apartment block near the Kroll Opera House. The Germans had turned the building into a fortress. Machine guns in the basement, snipers on the roof, and Panzerfausts everywhere. Volkov's T-34 was battered. The logs were splintered and charred. One was gone completely. But the bed springs, the mesh screens, were still there, welded to the turret. They looked ridiculous, like a cage from a zoo. But the crew wasn't laughing. They had heard the stories, the rumors. Tank 311 had taken a hit to the mesh and survived. Tank 504 had taken a hit and burned. It was a lottery. They were advancing across a public square. It was open ground, a kill zone. Speed, Volkov ordered. The tank accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour. German fire pinged off the hull. Small arms, useless. Then, a hidden anti-tank gun fired. A PaK-40. It missed, blowing a crater in the asphalt. Volkov saw the muzzle flash. Suppression! Zaitsev fired a high-explosive round, silencing the gun. But the distraction had worked. While they were engaging the gun, a squad of Volkssturm, old men and boys, popped up from a subway entrance to their right. Range, 20 meters, point blank. 3 Panzerfausts fired simultaneously. One missed, flying high. One hit the front glacis plate. It detonated. The jet burned a hole through the armor, killing the driver, Ivanenko, instantly. The tank lurched to a halt, slewing sideways. Ivanenko! Volkov screamed. No answer. The 3rd Panzerfaust headed straight for the turret, straight for Volkov's head. Time slowed down. Volkov saw the black warhead. He saw the grimace on the face of the old man who fired it. The warhead slammed into the wire mesh screen. Screech! It didn't detonate. Not instantly. The nose of the warhead caught in the grid of the bed spring. The momentum carried it forward, but the mesh held. It acted like a flexible net. The warhead twisted. The fuse assembly was crushed against the steel wire, but the angle was wrong. It didn't compress straight back. The explosive filler detonated. Boom! But the shaped charge was now facing sideways. The jet of molten copper shot out parallel to the turret armor. It sliced through the air, creating a sonic crack, and decapitated a statue in the square. The blast wave rocked the turret. The mesh screen was ripped away, flying off into the smoke. But the turret armor was untouched. Volkov was deafened. His nose was bleeding from the concussion, but he was alive. "Zaitsev! Traverse right! Machine gun!" The turret whined. The coaxial MG opened up, cutting down the Volksturm squad in the subway entrance. "Driver is dead!" the hull gunner shouted. "I'm taking the controls!" The hull gunner pulled Ivanenko's body out of the seat and grabbed the steering levers. "Get us to cover!" Volkov ordered. The tank, now limping, backed away behind a pile of rubble. They sat there for 10 minutes, shaking. Volkov climbed out to inspect the damage. There was a hole in the front armor the size of a coin. Ivanenko was gone. But on the turret, the steel was scorched black. The bed spring was gone. But there was no hole, just a deep gouge where the explosion had scrubbed the metal. The mesh had worked. It had tipped the warhead just enough. Maybe 15 degrees. That 15 degrees was the difference between life and death. Volkov looked at the twisted remains of the bed frame lying in the street. He thought about the farmhouse where they had stolen it. He thought about the German family who had slept on it. Now, it lay in the ruins of Berlin. A piece of trash that had defeated the best anti-tank technology of the Third Reich. He climbed back in. "Load armor piercing," he whispered. "For Ivanenko." May 2nd, 1945. The shooting stopped. General Weidling, the commander of the Berlin defense, surrendered. Volkov parked his battered T-34 near the Brandenburg Gate. The tank was a wreck. One headlight was dangling by a wire. The fenders were crushed. The logs were gone, burned or blown away. The turret was scarred with shrapnel hits. But it was there. Soviet war photographers swarmed the area. They took photos of the soldiers celebrating. You can see these photos today. Look closely at the tanks in the background. They don't look like the pristine machines in the museums. They are covered in debris. Bed frames, wire mesh, sheet metal, and logs. Lots of logs. Volkov sat on the edge of the turret, smoking a cigarette. He watched a column of German prisoners marching past. Thousands of them. Among them, he saw boys, 12, 13 years old, crying. And on the ground, scattered like confetti, were thousands of unused Panzerfausts. The weapon that should have won the urban war had failed. Why? Because of courage? Yes. Because of numbers? Yes. But also because of adaptation. The German engineers had assumed the Russians would fight fair, that they would present clean steel targets. They didn't account for the Russian capacity to turn a tank into a moving fortress of junk. They didn't account for the stupid armor. But there is a bitter postscript to this victory. A few months after the war, the Red Army conducted formal tests at the Kubinka Proving Ground. They took captured Panzerfausts and fired them at T-34s, equipped with mesh screens and logs. The results were disappointing. In controlled conditions, the Panzerfaust still penetrated the mesh about 50% of the time. The logs only stopped the jet if the hit was perfectly centered on the wood. The report concluded that the improvised armor was statistically unreliable. So, was Volkov just lucky? Was it all a placebo? Not exactly. In combat, nothing is a controlled condition. In combat, the shooter is terrified. His hands are shaking. The angle is never perfect. The tank is moving. In that chaos, the mesh and the logs added variables. They added a chance for the fuse to fail, for the round to tumble, for the jet to lose focus. But more importantly, the armor provided psychological protection. A tank crew that feels naked is timid. They hesitate. They stay back. A tank crew that believes they are protected, even if it's a lie, is aggressive. Volkov survived because he pushed into that alleyway. He pushed into that square. The logs gave him the confidence to take the risk. And aggression wins battles. Nikolai Volkov survived the war. He went back to his village in the Urals. He never drove a tank again. The T-34s of the Berlin operation were mostly scrapped or sent to aid Soviet allies in the Middle East and Africa. The logs rotted. The bed springs were melted down to build new cities. The era of improvised armor seemed to be over. The Cold War brought high-tech composite armor, reactive armor bricks, and active protection systems. But history is a circle. Fast forward to 2003, Iraq. American Stryker vehicles are getting hit by RPG-7s, the grandson of the Panzerfaust. What do the American crews do? They bolt slat armor, metal cages, to the sides of their vehicles. It looks exactly like the bed springs of Berlin. The principle is the same. Catch the warhead, crush the fuse, disrupt the jet. Fast forward to 2011. Syria. T-72 tanks are seen with sandbags and rebar welded to the turrets. Fast forward to 2022. Ukraine. Russian tanks appear with cope cages, grills welded to the roof to stop top-attack missiles like the Javelin. Sometimes they work. Usually, they don't. But the crews keep building them. And if you look closely at a modern Russian T-90 or T-72, even the high-tech ones, look at the rear. Strapped to the back, right above the engine exhaust. A log. A simple, unpainted pine log. Officially, it's an unditching beam. A tool for mud. But every tanker knows it's more than that. It's a talisman. A connection to Volkov and the men of 1945. It is a reminder that no matter how advanced warfare becomes, no matter how many microchips, lasers, or drones you have, war is ultimately about mud, steel, and the desperate desire to survive. Sometimes, the difference between life and death isn't a $1 million defense system. Sometimes, it's just a piece of wood you stole from a forest. The Germans laughed at the log tanks. They called them primitive. They called them stupid. But on May 9th, 1945, the stupid tanks were parked in front of the Reichstag, and the smart weapons were lying in the dirt. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the weird reality of tank warfare, you have to watch this video right here. It's the story of how one American mechanic used a soup can to fix a B-29 bomber engine in mid-flight. It's another example of how MacGyver engineering saved the day when the manual failed. Click right here. I'll see you there.